The wind howled across the Kansas plains, dry and bitter, carrying dust through every crack of the old Wynn farmhouse. Inside, Clara Wynn moved through the dim kitchen with quiet purpose, feeding the fire, setting bread to bake, and pouring coffee that her father would only half drink before finding something to complain about. The house felt empty now. It had been years since her mother's laughter had filled these rooms or her sister's chatter had echoed down the hallway. One by one, they had married and left, 4 sisters, each with new names and new lives. They sent letters sometimes, full of talk about babies and harvests and church picnics, but never invitations to visit. No one ever asked Clara to come stay. She was the one who had stayed behind to care for Samuel Wynn, their father, the man who had become a shell of himself since their mother's death. Samuel sat at the table that morning, staring out the window at the barren fields. "You'd think after all these years you'd have learned to make coffee that don't taste like creek water," he grumbled. Clara set down the pot, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the same beans we've always had, Pa. That so?" he said, his tone sharp. "Maybe it's just you. Everything you touch turns plain." She turned away before he could see her face fall. She'd grown used to the barbs, the way he could twist even small things into insults. Once he had been a kind man, steady, proud, quick to laugh. But when droughts came, when cattle died, when the bank letters started arriving, something inside him turned to stone. He blamed the world first, then fate, then the people closest to him, and Clara, being the only one left, took the brunt of it. When the banker came that afternoon, hat in hand, Samuel's bitterness spilled over. The ranch was sinking deeper into debt, he was told. Without a miracle, he would lose it by winter. After the banker left, Samuel paced the floor like a man hunted. "If I'd had a son," he muttered, "things be different. A boy could have saved this land. But no, the Lord saw fit to fill my house with daughters." Clara stood in the doorway, clutching a rag in her hand. "Pa," she said softly, "I can help. Maybe I could find work in town." "I'll send money back." He turned on her, his eyes flashing. "Work? You? What do you know about work? You can't ride herd, can't mend fences, can't even speak loud enough to make a man listen. You're a curse, Clara, always have been." The word curse stuck in her chest, heavy and cold. But worse followed. "Worthless," he spat. "That's what you are. A burden I should have sent off years ago." The kitchen went quiet except for the ticking of the clock. Clara didn't cry. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that he wasn't just angry at her. He was angry at life, at death, at his own failures. But knowing that didn't make his words hurt any less. When night came and he'd passed out in his chair, she packed a small satchel, her mother's Bible, a clean dress, and a locket that held a faded photograph. She hesitated at the door, her heart pounding, then left a note on the table. "I'll not be a burden anymore, Pa. May God forgive the both of us." The dawn was just breaking when she stepped outside. The air smelled of dust and distance, and the first light caught her face, pale, trembling, but determined. She looked back only once at the house that had never felt like home. And then Clara Wynn walked toward the road that led west. She didn't know what waited beyond those hills, but she knew one thing with a certainty she'd never felt before. She was not worthless. Not anymore. The road west stretched endlessly before Clara Wynn, a ribbon of dust and sunlight winding through open country. For the first time in her life, she had no destination, no duty, and no one expecting her to return. Her few coins jingled softly in her pocket, the last of what she'd managed to trade from selling her mother as embroidered shawl at a crossroads town. Hunger tugged at her belly, but freedom filled her lungs. Each step she took away from her father's ranch felt like a small act of healing. She followed wagon trails for days, sleeping near creeks and old cottonwoods, working odd tasks for food when she could. Most people she met didn't ask questions. They just saw another weary traveler. But the West was no gentle place for a woman alone. Men looked too long, and opportunities often came with a price she wasn't willing to pay. Still, Clara's quiet determination, that soft, steady will that her father once called weakness, kept her moving forward. One afternoon, her luck turned. She stumbled into a dusty way station outside the small frontier town of Red Hollow. Her dress was torn, her boots worn through, and her throat dry as sand. The station keeper's wife, Mrs. Harlan, took pity on her. "You look half-starved, dear," she said kindly, ushering Clara inside. "Rest a spell. The world will still be there when you wake." Clara helped in the kitchen in exchange for food and a corner to sleep in. For the first time in weeks, she felt almost safe. But fate, as it often did, had other plans. A few days later, while she was unloading sacks of flour in the yard, the sound of hooves thundered in from the plains. A rider approached, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in trail-worn leather. His horse was lathered with sweat, and dust clung to his hat brim. He swung down easily and spoke in a low, calm drawl that somehow carried authority without effort. "Evenin', Mrs. Harlan," he said, nodding politely before his eyes landed on Clara. "Heard you've got an extra hand who can cook." Mrs. Harlan chuckled. "She can cook, sweep, mend, and work circles around most men. But she's only been here a week, Mr. Hart." The man turned his gaze fully toward Clara. "Mr. Silas Hart," he said, tipping his hat. "I own the Hart Ranch 30 miles west. Lost my housekeeper to marriage and my patients to mess." Clara blinked. "You're hiring?" "Housekeeper," he confirmed. "Honest pay? Roof over your head meals. You'll be left to your work in peace, if you know how to mind both." There was something in his voice, not charm, not pity, but respect. She studied him for a moment. His face was weathered by sun and years, but his eyes were steady, the color of storm clouds. He didn't look like a cruel man. He looked like one who'd known loss and learned to live alongside it. Mrs. Harlan whispered, "You could do worse, child." "Man's quiet, but fair." Clara hesitated only a moment longer. "I'll take the job," she said. The next morning, she climbed into the back of Silas Hart's wagon, her meager belongings tucked at her feet. The road stretched wide and empty, the sun bleeding gold across the horizon. Neither of them spoke much. But as the wind whipped through her hair, Clara felt something stir deep inside her. Not fear, not uncertainty, but a fragile spark of hope. When they reached the Hart Ranch by dusk, she saw sprawling land fenced against the wild, the silhouette of a large house standing against the sky. It was lonely, beautiful, and alive in a way her father's ranch had never been. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his voice quiet. "You'll find the kitchen to your left. Sheets are clean, bed's yours. Don't work past your strength. The land's patient. It'll wait for you." Clara nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in years, someone had told her not to exhaust herself, not to earn her worth, but to keep it. As the sun dipped behind the hills, she looked at the wide, open fields and whispered to herself, "Maybe this is where I start over." And though she didn't yet know it, that moment, a stranger's kindness, a quiet ranch, and a promise of peace, was the first step toward the redemption she'd been walking toward all along. Weeks passed, and the Hart Ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. Morning light would spill across the plains, painting gold on the hills, and Clara Wynne would rise before dawn to light the stove and start breakfast. Silas would come in from the barn, smelling of leather and rain, offering a soft mornin' before washing up. Then they'd share coffee and quiet companionship, no harsh words. No sharp tones, only the easy silence of two people who'd learned to find comfort in stillness. To Clara, those mornings became something she cherished. For so long, silence had been punishment, her father's way of making her feel small and unseen. But here, with Silas Hart, it meant something else entirely. It was peace. It was safety. After breakfast, Silas would head out to the range while Clara tended the house. She mended clothes, gathered eggs, watered the small garden, and sometimes rode the wagon to town for supplies. Life was hard work, but it was honest work. Work that gave her a sense of worth she'd never known before. Still, as the summer deepened, whispers began to follow her whenever she went into Red Hollow. "That's the girl Silas Hart hired," someone would murmur near the general store. Heard she came alone. No family, no husband. Strange thing, him tacking her in like that. Small towns had long memories and restless tongues. Clara felt their eyes on her, their judgment thick as dust in the air. But she kept her head down, answering kindness with kindness, never offering more than she had to. It wasn't the first time she'd been called names behind her back, and she knew better than to fight ghosts. One afternoon, as she was loading supplies into the wagon, a man approached her. Dale Granger, the sheriff's son, tall and smug, with a reputation for trouble. "Well now," he drawled, leaning on the railing, "if it ain't the pretty housekeeper from the Hart place." "Folks been wondering what kind of work you're really doing out there." Clara froze, her jaw tightening. "You've no right to speak to me that way." He grinned, stepping closer. "I've got every right to speak to whoever I please. But if I were you, I'd be careful. Lonely men get ideas and lonely women get reputations." Before she could reply, a shadow fell across them. Silas had appeared without a sound, his broad frame blocking the sun. His voice was calm, but cold as steel. "You finished talking, Granger?" The younger man's smirk faltered. "Just making conversation. Then do it elsewhere." Dale gave a low whistle and backed away, muttering something under his breath before disappearing down the street. Clara stood silent, her heart pounding. Silas turned to her, his hat brim dripping rainwater from a passing storm cloud. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Yes." "Thank you." He studied her for a moment, then said simply, "Don't thank me for doing what's right." On the way home, the air between them was thick with unspoken things. Clara wanted to tell him how much it meant, to be defended, to be seen, but the words wouldn't come. Silas didn't press her. He just guided the wagon through the prairie grass, his hands steady on the reins, his presence enough to quiet her trembling heart. That night, as the crickets sang and the moon rose over the open plains, Clara sat by her window, staring out at the stars. For the first time, she let herself wonder what kind of man Silas Hart really was. Not just her employer, but the one person who made her feel she might be more than what her family had called her. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was broken too. But whatever shadow he carried, it never reached her. With him, she felt seen, not for what she'd done or what she'd lost, but simply for who she was. The prairie wind whispered through the fields outside, carrying secrets and promises alike. And Clara, for the first time, began to feel something dangerous and tender growing inside her, not just gratitude, but hope. Autumn crept across the prairie slowly, brushing gold over the grasslands and chill into the air. The Hart Ranch shifted with the season, harvest chores, mending fences before snow, preparing the barns for the cold months ahead. For Clara Wynne, it was the first autumn she could remember without dread. There were no sharp words in the air, no footsteps to fear, no weight of failure pressing on her shoulders. Life here moved by the rhythm of the land, not the temper of a man. Yet even in peace, old wounds have a way of whispering. One afternoon, Clara was hanging linens on the line when she heard the distant rumble of hooves. Silas was returning early from town, his hat low against the wind. But as he approached, she noticed a folded paper in his hand, a letter. When he reached the porch, he handed it to her wordlessly. "It's for you," he said, his voice quiet. "Came through the post office. Red Hollow don't get much mail for strangers." Clara took it with trembling hands. Her name, Miss Clara Wynne, was scrawled in her sister Margaret's handwriting, elegant, precise, and unmistakable. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Inside the letter, the words were polite but cold. Margaret wrote that their father had fallen ill, not gravely, but enough to make her worry. Then came the line that stung more than any. If you have any conscience left, you should come home and do what little you can to make peace before it is too late. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her eyes burning. Peace? The man who had called her worthless, who had thrown her out with words sharper than any whip, now needed her forgiveness? Silas watched her quietly, his expression unreadable. Bad news? She shook her head, folding the letter back up. No, just the past trying to follow me. He nodded slowly. It tends to do that. For the rest of the evening, Clara worked in silence. She burned the letter after supper, feeding it to the fire and watching the edges curl into ash. But even as the paper vanished, the memories didn't. She saw her father's face, heard his voice, the way he'd looked at her like she was a burden, not a daughter. And now he was weak, maybe dying, and the thought twisted something deep inside her. Later that night, she found Silas outside by the corral, oiling a saddle under the lantern's light. The warm glow touched his face, made the lines around his eyes softer. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice small. He glanced up. "You can ask me anything. What if someone hurt you, over and over, and now they say they're sorry? What if they want forgiveness only because they've run out of time?" Silas didn't answer right away. He set the saddle aside, leaning his elbows on his knees. "Depends on what you need," he said finally. "If you forgive him for their sake, it's mercy. But if you forgive him for your own, it's freedom." Clara let the words settle. She stared at him, the firelight flickering across his features. "Did you forgive the ones who hurt you?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw something raw flicker behind his calm eyes, a pain deep and buried. "Not all of them," he admitted. "But I stopped letting them live rent-free in my head. That was enough." She nodded slowly, her throat thick. They stood there in the quiet, the prairie wind sighing between them. The world felt vast, and yet in that small circle of lamplight, it felt like the only thing that existed was the space they shared. Two souls learning to live with their scars. When Clara went to bed that night, she realized something had changed. The letter had reopened her past, but Silas's words had given her a choice to be haunted by it or to outgrow it. And for the first time, she believed she could. Winter arrived on the plains like a quiet beast, slow, creeping, and relentless. The grass turned brittle and white with frost, the wind sharper than knives. At the Hart Ranch, everything slowed down. The cattle were driven close to shelter, and the fields slept beneath a thin crust of snow. Inside the house, the world grew smaller, softer. The long, cold evenings drew Clara Wynne and Silas Hart into a rhythm that neither of them had expected. He would sit by the fire, mending harness leather or reading old newspapers, while Clara stitched quilts or baked bread to keep her hands busy. Words were still few between them, but the silence had changed, no longer empty, but comfortable. Sometimes, when the wind howled against the shutters, Silas would glance toward her and say something simple but warm. "You all right over there?" Or, "That pie smells like it could melt the snow off the roof." Those small, ordinary phrases carried a tenderness that stirred something inside her chest. One night after the fire burned low, Silas stood and fetched another log. "Storm's comin'," he said. "We'll be snowed in a few days at least," Clara smiled faintly. "Then I'll make enough stew to last through it." "You always think ahead," he said, almost to himself. Then, after a pause, "You remind me of my wife." Clara froze. In all the weeks she'd known him, Silas had never spoken of her. "She died 3 winters ago," he continued, setting the log carefully into the flames. "Fever took her before spring came. We didn't have children. Just the 2 of us in this land. I'm sorry," Clara whispered. He nodded once. "So was I. For a long time, I thought the Lord left me here to live out my days alone. Then you showed up, tired, stubborn, half-starved, but looking at the world like it still owed you a chance. Reminded me there's still work worth doing." His words stunned her. She stared at the fire, her hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't mean to stay this long," she admitted softly. "I only meant to rest a while before moving on." He studied her for a moment. "Ain't a thing wrong with staying somewhere that feels right." The storm arrived. The next morning, thick snow that fell for 3 days without pause. The ranch disappeared beneath a white silence. The men couldn't ride out, and even the cattle huddled close for warmth. Inside, Clara and Silas worked side by side, chopping wood, feeding the horses, cooking whatever they could find. On the third night, when the wind screamed like a living thing outside, the house lost its warmth. The fire burned low, and Silas came in from the barn with ice clinging to his coat. His face was pale with cold, his hands shaking as he stripped off his gloves. "Frost's got the stovepipes," he muttered. "We'll freeze if it ain't fixed." Without thinking, Clara grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Her hands brushed his neck, rough skin, warm beneath the cold. He looked down at her, eyes shadowed but gentle. "You shouldn't worry so much," he said quietly. "I can't help it," she whispered. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Silas reached out, his calloused hand lifting her chin. "I didn't do it for what you could give me, Clara. I did it because you deserve to be seen for who you are, not what others told you to be." Her breath caught. There was no demand in his tone, no claim, only truth. When he stepped back, the space between them glowed with something unspoken but undeniable. That night, as the storm raged outside, Clara lay awake in her small room, her heart full and aching. The man downstairs, quiet, steady, scarred, had seen through her fears without judgment. He didn't call her weak or worthless. He called her worthy. And though neither of them said the word aloud, somewhere deep within, a promise had taken root, a promise born not of need, but of understanding. By late January, winter had wrapped the Hart Ranch in silence. The snowdrifts rose high against the fences, the sky stayed gray for weeks, and the only sound at night was the wind whispering over the frozen plains. Inside the house, warmth came not just from the hearth, but from something wordless that had begun to grow between Clara Wynne and Silas Hart, slow, patient, and alive. It started with small things. The way he'd pour her coffee before his own. The way she'd leave his gloves warming by the fire. He'd fix the latch on her window without being asked, and she'd mend his shirts even when they didn't truly need mending. These quiet gestures built something steady, something that felt more real than the words they were too careful to speak. Still, neither dared to name it. Silas was a man scarred by loss. Clara, a woman haunted by rejection. They both carried ghosts that whispered caution. For her, love had always been tied to hurt, her father's scorn, her family's dismissal, the cruel laughter of men who saw her as less. For him, love had been taken too soon, buried beneath winter ground. Yet as the weeks passed, they began to find warmth even in the coldest mornings. One evening, after the chores were done and supper cleared away, Silas came into the kitchen with his coat dusted white from the snow. "Fence by the creek's down," he said. "Wolves been prowlin'." "I'll need to ride out at first light," Clara frowned, setting down her dishcloth. "It's too cold for that. You could freeze before you reach the ridge." He gave her a faint, lopsided smile. "If I don't fix it, we'll lose half the herd." "Can't afford that." She hesitated, biting her lip. "Then I'm going with you." His eyebrows lifted. "You?" "I can hold a lantern, pass the wire, keep you from working yourself half to death. I'm not afraid of a little cold." He chuckled softly, a sound she'd rarely heard but would never forget. "You're stubborn, Miss Wynne. Learn from the best," she said, meeting his gaze. At dawn, the world was silver with frost. They rode out together, breath clouding the air, the prairie endless and white. Clara's fingers ached from the chill, but she didn't complain. Silas worked with steady focus, tightening wire and driving posts, his movements sure and practiced. When a gust of wind nearly knocked her off balance, he caught her arm, steadying her. Their eyes met for a heartbeat too long, and something flickered there, fragile and bright. "Careful," he murmured, his hand lingering just a moment before he let go. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her pulse betrayed her. By the time they finished, the sun had begun to sink, bleeding color into the horizon. The ride home was quiet, the horses' hooves muffled by snow. Clara could feel warmth radiating from Silas beside her, not from touch, but from presence. Safe, steady, familiar. That night, back by the fire, he poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. "You did good out there," he said. "Better than most men I've hired," Clara smiled faintly. "You mean better than most men you scare off," he laughed again, low, rough, and genuine. "Maybe so." Then his voice softened. "But you're not like most. You've got a kind of strength that don't need shouting to be known." Her throat tightened. "You really think so?" "I know so," he said simply. The air between them thickened with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist, only the soft glow of the hearth, the storm fading beyond the windows, and the quiet heartbeat of something new. Neither spoke of love. They didn't need to. It lived in the silence, in the glance that lingered, the hand that brushed too close, the way they both sat a little nearer to the fire than they had the night before. And in that fragile peace, Clara realized something she never thought she'd feel again. She wanted to stay. The first signs of spring came early that year. The snow began to melt in patches, and the prairie grass pushed through like green whispers of hope. But the thaw brought more than warmth. It brought change. One morning, while Clara Wynne was tending to the washing line, a rider appeared on the road leading to the Hart Ranch. He carried a leather satchel and the look of someone with unwelcome news. Clara wiped her hands on her apron as the man dismounted. "Delivery from Red Hollow," he said, pulling an envelope from his coat. "For Miss Clara Wynne." Her heart stuttered. Few people in the world even knew where she was. The paper was smudged with travel dust, but the handwriting was familiar. Margaret's again, her eldest sister. Clara hesitated before taking it. After the rider left, she stood on the porch, staring at the letter for a long time before breaking the seal. The message inside was brief, written with a kind of cool efficiency that told Clara her sister's sense of duty outweighed her sentiment. "Father passed last week. He asked for you at the end. The funeral is done. His land will be sold. I hope you find peace where you are. No apology." No warmth, just finality. The words blurred as tears filled Clara's eyes. She sank onto the steps, the letter trembling in her hands. For so long, she had dreamt of hearing her father say he was sorry, or at least that he de-loved her in some quiet, buried way. Now it was too late. Whatever he might have realized in his final days would never reach her ears. When Silas Hart came up from the barn and saw her sitting there, he stopped short. "Clara?" She didn't look up. "He's gone," she whispered. "My father. I didn't go back when they asked. Now he's gone." Silas knelt beside her, his gloved hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You couldn't have known. I could have forgiven him," she said, voice trembling. "I could have gone back and told him I wasn't angry anymore, but I didn't. I was too proud. Or maybe too afraid." He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "Forgiveness doesn't always need witnesses. Sometimes saying it in your heart is enough." She looked at him then, eyes filled with grief. "Did you ever forgive your wife for leaving you behind?" Silas's face softened, though sorrow flickered in his eyes. "Every day," he said. "Took a long time to learn that love don't end just 'cause a person is gone. It just changes shape." Something in his voice broke through her pain. She leaned into him, not out of weakness, but because he felt like the only solid thing left in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. He didn't pull away. His arm came around her shoulders, steady and warm, grounding her. The letter slipped from her hand and drifted onto the porch. Neither of them reached for it. As dusk settled, Clara stood beside Silas by the fence line. The horizon stretched endless and quiet, the sky painted in gold and purple. She thought of her father, his anger, his fear, his broken pride, and for the first time she didn't feel hatred or sorrow, only release. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not asking me to be stronger than I am." Silas looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "You're stronger than you think, but strength ain't about never crying. It's about still standing when you're done." That night, Clara sat by the fire long after he'd gone to bed, staring into the flames. The pain was still there, but it had changed, quieter now, softened by understanding. Her father's shadow no longer owned her heart. And somewhere deep inside, beneath grief and ash, something new began to flicker, a fragile, glowing spark that looked very much like freedom. Spring deepened on the Hart Ranch, and with it came the rhythm of renewal. Calves were born, the river thawed, and the scent of lilac drifted through the air. Yet amid all that new life, Clara Wynne felt an ache she couldn't name, something between gratitude and longing. It had been weeks since her father's passing, but the grief had softened into reflection. She found herself waking earlier, watching dawn spill across the plains, wondering if her father's soul could see her now, living free, loved in quiet ways he had never understood. Silas Hart had been patient through her mourning. He didn't pry or fill the silence with hollow comfort. He worked beside her, steady as always, fixing fences, tending horses, checking the sky for rain. But his eyes followed her more often now, lingering with a tenderness he didn't try to hide. One afternoon, as Clara was brushing down the chestnut mare, Silas came to the stable door. "Rode out to the east pasture today," he said. "Found some wildflowers coming up by the creek." Clara smiled faintly. "Already?" "Seems early." "Guess they couldn't wait." He hesitated, holding out something in his hand, a small bunch of yellow blossoms, stems still wet from the ride. "Figured they'd look better in your kitchen than out there alone." Her throat tightened. She took them gently. "They're beautiful." "So are you," he said softly, before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air between them, simple and raw. Clara froze, the petals trembling in her fingers. She had been called many things in her life, useless, plain, barren, but never beautiful. She looked up at him, searching his face for jest, but there was none. Only truth. "Silas." She began, but her voice faltered. He stepped closer, his tone low, steady. "You don't need to say nothin'. I just needed you to know. You've brought this place back to life, not with your hands, though God knows they work harder than mine, but with your heart." Her eyes filled with tears. "You think I've brought life to this place?" "You're the one who gave me mine back." He shook his head. "You did that yourself." They stood there, two souls who had both forgotten how to reach for warmth, finding it in each other's presence. The air felt charged, not with desire, but with understanding, a quiet recognition that what they shared was real. But fear tugged at her heart. "Silas, I'm not what most men want. I can't give you children, or—" He reached out, silencing her with a touch to her cheek. "I don't need an heir, Clara. I need a heart like yours." The words struck deep, like sunlight after a long winter. No one had ever wanted her for who she was, not out of duty, not out of pity, but out of love. Her voice trembled. "You don't mean that." He smiled faintly. "You think I'd say it if I didn't?" She laughed softly through her tears. "You're a hard man to argue with, Mr. Hart. Then don't." He didn't kiss her then, not yet. Instead, he simply held her gaze until she felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. The silence that followed was sacred, filled with all the words neither needed to say. Outside, the evening light poured golden through the barn doors. The horses shifted softly, and the world seemed to hush around them. Clara placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. "Then let me stay," she whispered, "for as long as you'll have me." Silas covered her hand with his own. "Darlin', I reckon I already do." And just like that, the walls both of them had carried for years began to crumble, not in a storm of passion, but in a quiet, steadfast promise. That love, when it finally came, would not demand or destroy. It would simply be. The days lengthened into summer, and life on the Hart Ranch pulsed with quiet joy. The air was rich with the scent of sage and wild roses, and the river ran full again, glinting like silver in the sun. For the first time in years, Clara Wynne woke each morning without fear of what the day might bring. She had come to this place a broken woman, unwanted and unseen. Yet here she had found something she never expected: belonging. Silas Hart kept his promise. He didn't rush her, didn't try to change what they were. Instead, he gave her space to breathe, to heal, to become the woman she'd hidden away for so long. They worked side by side from dawn till dusk, their words few but their silences comfortable. Every moment felt grounded, as though life had finally slowed to a rhythm both of them understood. One afternoon, Clara stood by the corral watching a foal take its first shaky steps. She smiled as the little creature stumbled, then found its footing, strong and sure. Silas came up beside her, wiping sweat from his brow. "She's a fighter," he said, nodding toward the foal. "Reminds me of someone else," Clara teased. He gave a soft laugh, the sound of a man who hadn't forgotten how to feel alive. "Maybe both of us." They watched in silence, the prairie wind lifting strands of Clara's hair. Silas turned toward her, his gaze steady. "You know," he began quietly, "when you first came here, I thought you were going to stay a week, maybe two. You looked like someone running from ghosts." "I was," she admitted. "But the strange thing is, when I came here, the ghosts stopped following. I think maybe they knew they weren't needed anymore." He studied her for a long moment. "So what'll you do now, Clara Wynne, now that you're not running?" She hesitated, her heart quickening. "I don't want to leave, Silas. Not the ranch. Not you." He took a step closer. "You don't have to." Her breath caught. "You mean that?" "I meant it the day I told you I didn't need an heir. I just needed you. And I still do." The words fell softly, but they carried the weight of everything they'd lived through: loss, loneliness, and the fragile courage to begin again. Clara's eyes glistened. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have. A place. A purpose. A heart that's whole again." Silas reached out, taking her hand in his. "And you've given me peace." I'd forgotten what that felt like. For a long, quiet moment, the world seemed to still around them. The breeze gentle, the horses calm, the land vast and endless beneath the golden light. Then, with a tenderness that felt inevitable, Silas brushed his lips against hers. It wasn't a kiss of urgency or passion, but one of promise, steady, sure, and full of everything neither had dared to say. When they pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against his chest, smiling through tears. "You know, I used to pray for a place to belong. I never thought it would be here, or with you." He smiled, voice rough. "Sometimes God answers prayers by sending you somewhere you didn't plan to go." Weeks passed and the ranch flourished. The garden Clara planted bloomed in color. The foal grew strong. Laughter returned to the house that had once been too quiet. At night, when they sat by the fire, Silas would read aloud from the worn Bible his wife had once kept. Clara would listen, her hand in his, feeling the warmth of a life rebuilt from ashes. One evening, as stars shimmered over the prairie, Silas turned to her and said, "You ever think about how far you've come?" Clara smiled softly. "Every day." But the truth is, I didn't come this far alone." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "No, ma'am, you didn't." And as the wind whispered through the open fields, Clara realized that home wasn't just a place. It was a heart that saw you, chose you, and stayed. She had spent her life being told she was worthless, but here, with Silas, she finally understood the truth. She had always been enough. And now she was loved.